You ever been curious about people selling their property management company right now, what the process is like, but more importantly, who those buyers are and what they're looking for? That is why I brought onto the show my friend Nick Molina. Nick has recently purchased Kleinman Realty, a residential property management company serving the Twin Cities for over 95 years. But Nick's been doing this for a long time. At one point, he was the youngest CEO to take a company public. And I'm lucky to just have him in my network by happenstance over the last 10 years, which led to this conversation. Nick has now become known as the ETA guy. That's entrepreneurship through acquisition. This is the new breed of buyer that's coming into the property management space, looking at businesses like yours and debating what to pay for them. So if you ever want to go down that path, if you ever want to get to this liquidation event, getting inside the mindset of how Nick thinks about this, the sooner the better for you, right? And quite frankly, me as the kind of noble fool in the room, I got to ask him all the dumb questions that you probably are going to feel too awkward to ask if you ever get into one of these conversations. So get those out of the way, right? Get educated on this and just get as much as you can out of this episode. If you want to have a conversation about this, I'm up for it, right? Because this is something that I've been through recently. Not a lot of people as the seller have a lot of reps in this. So a guy like Nick, access to a guy like Nick is super, super valuable just from the mindset alone. But apart from that, just a super cool guy. I call him the Sylvester Stallone of entrepreneurship. You'll see why. Enjoy this conversation with Nick Molina. Welcome to the Property Management Frame Breakers podcast. I'm your host, Pablo Gonzalez, and I am here to introduce you to the folks in the property management space that have broken the frame of what you may believe was possible. This podcast is presented by Vendoroo. It is your all-in-one AI solution for resolving your maintenance needs. Let's go. Nick Molina. How you doing, man?
Hey, man, I'm doing great. It's good to see you, Pablo.
It's good to see you too, man. It's good to see you too. You were my second ever podcast episode, and now you're 1,001.
1,001 apparently.
1,001. We'll have better audio quality on this one, right?
The audio quality was a little lacking on the last one.
Conversation was so good, and the audio quality was
I
so
didn't even know what a podcast was until you asked me to be on one.
I barely knew what it was when I asked you to be on one. All right, so theme of this show, right? This idea of property management is changing. There's a lot of context changes happening. One of the context changes is this idea of Wall Street coming into the space, right? People that are, number one, Wall Street's coming in the sense of investing in the asset class, right? The single family asset class, the multifamily asset class at a higher level than before. But another context change we don't talk as much about is this entrepreneur through acquisition era that we're kind of in, right? And you as the ETA guy, the entrepreneurship through acquisition guy, do you want to kind of define that, what it is and kind of what's happening? Is it an era?
Well, it's a movement that's, I think, being facilitated by this great wealth transfer that we have with boomers, hitting retirement and all these businesses going up for sale or needing to go up for sale because there's no other transition plan, right? A lot of times, their heirs, their kids don't want these businesses. And so all their wealth is tied up in these businesses. And the only way for them to cash out, so to speak, is to sell. Yeah. And so, these deals are typically too small for private equity. That's kind of where this space fills that void, right? And so, we're talking about businesses that have, EBITDA of anywhere from, a couple $100,000 up to $2-3 million, maybe $4 million that are too small for private equity. It's as much work to paper a $1 million deal as it is a $10 million deal for the most part, right? Yeah. And so the juice isn't worth the squeeze for private equity, but for guys like me, it is. And so I found great value in that, and that's I also call it micro private equity, so to speak. Yeah. Right? So it's kind of the same thing, but on a much smaller scale, and a little bit closer to the operating of the business that private equity typically gets.
Cool. As an outsider to the private equity game, what I'm hearing is essentially there is folks that do this at a really, really big scale, and they have always kind of had their niche of where they eat. And now, thanks to freedom of information, more sophistication on tools, whatever it may be, and this great generational wealth transfer, a new niche, a new opportunity has appeared, and it's worthwhile to a new breed of people that before weren't interested in doing this. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, well, it's a niche and an opportunity, but it also fills a need, right? And the need is for the cash out of these boomers, right? That these business owners.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's also a little bit of a difference in end game, you know, for these businesses between private equity and an ETA entrepreneur like me. Private equity is clearly in the business to get in the game and to get out of the game, right? Play the multiple arbitrage, sell the business later for more money, you know, cash out their investors. They have literal guidelines that they follow, or they need to liquidate these investments. Somebody like me could be operating this business for legacy value, right? I don't need to be operating it to exit it. Some ETA entrepreneurs do.
Yeah.
Some don't. Some do a little bit of both.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So in there, I hear, as a real estate investor, I think there's like a buy box and a sell box. The old game had very tight buy boxes and sell boxes.
Yeah.
This new game of ETA now opens up a wider buy box and a wider sell box or exit box, whatever you're going to call it, right? Like you might want to just hold on to this thing. It's a legacy build business. Other people are really trying to flip it. What's your kind of approach of what you're doing?
Well, first of all, I think the buy box is not so wide. I think the buy box on ETA is pretty narrow.
Okay.
They're profitable businesses within a certain, you know, range of EBITDA, you know, that can take, you know, a certain amount of leverage on it. So the buy box is pretty well defined.
Okay. I guess it's a smaller size of box than what private equity looks like, but the same parameters. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And what was the follow-up question on that?
That was the buy box. What happens on the back end, right? Like if I'm equating this to real estate investing, I think of there's people that buy to flip, there's people that wholesale, there's people that buy and hold.
That's right.
And the private equity game is kind of like a flip game only, while this ETA game has kind of multiple variations of what the exit plan is or the end game is.
It depends on the buyer, right? What are the buyer's needs?
Yeah.
Right? Is the buyer, you know, a lot of younger ETA guys are coming in and they're looking to play the private equity typical game plan, which is basically get in at a 3x and get out at a 7x or an 8x or a 10x. Then you got other guys that are coming in and saying, you know what, I want to build a lifestyle around this. You know, I want to build a legacy business around this. I want to grow this business. And so, yeah, there's different outcomes for different types of buyers.
Got it. Yeah, and that's right now when you just said it, I just thought of our mutual friend Zach, who is just like a young guy that rather do this and have a career in another company.
That's right.
And now that's really available to younger people
right.
too, because there's guys like you that are willing to like back it and stuff like that, right?
It kind of feels better too, man. I'm gonna tell you, like when you're in a business, you know, and I've had 6 exits, right? So I'm an exit guy. I'm not now, right? In the ETA space, I'm looking to buy these businesses with the intent of keeping and running them and keeping them and handing them down to my family.
Yeah.
It's not to say that that's going to happen every, you know, with every deal that I do, but that's kind of my goal. But it feels good to be able to build something of legacy value, something that lasts, and to see it grow rather than it just being fully transactional. You know, there's a feel good, right?
Yeah.
There's a feel good on that.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk to our friend that's listening to us right now, right? They are a property manager that has a business. They're like, oh yeah, there's a breed of cat out there that wants to buy my business, and I'm paying attention, right? All of a sudden, I'm either inheriting my dad's business, or I've been doing this for a while, and sure, it would be nice to just get some cash in my pocket and go figure out what I'm going to do over the next 10 years. How should they be thinking about it? What's the, you know, is there like a wide range of advice to be giving of, you know, like a foundational piece of if you're going to start taking calls from guys like you, how to approach this thing or how to get ready for it?
Yeah. So look, property management's not for everybody. It's just not, right? And so there's no shame in saying I want to sell my property management business. It's not for me. I mean, property managers do the work that nobody wants to do, right? And so it's tough, and you got to be you got to be a special breed to be able to do it and do it well. If you're looking to sell your property management business, I mean, number one, you have to have your books in order, right? Make sure that your books are in order. Make sure that you've got good P&Ls. Make sure your tax returns look good, and make sure your tax returns match your P&Ls. But aside from that, in terms of preparing yourself to sell the business, just run it well. Run your business, not necessarily with the intent of selling it. Run your business to benefit, to be a true value add for your customers, your clients, to be a true value add for the tenants. Run it well. If you run your business well and you make it profitable, the buyers will be there. They really will be. And then there is one other thing that I would say, and that is, don't make the business too dependent on one person. Single points of failure are huge red flags for guys like me, right? You can't own every relationship. You can't own every process. They all can't live in your head, Get SOPs created, build a team around you so that you're able to go on a 2-month vacation if you wanted to and still have the business run. Because if you can do that, then that means that a buyer coming in, isn't going to be afraid of you exiting.
Man, that's really motivating. I think the conversation of, can I build a business to take a 1-month vacation, can often seem very like, man, am I just doing this because I need a break? Or you might beat yourself up over that cause just for a vacation. But if you add the lens of, I'm building my team up so I can take a 1-month vacation, not just because I need to deserve it, which I think is a fair thing to feel, right? Yeah. But also because this actually adds enterprise value. It adds, value to the people working for me, and consistency is a big deal.
I use that. I made that statement as an example. I'm not saying that you should build a business so that you do take a 1-month vacation. Look, I've never taken a 1-month vacation in my entire career. I'm 56 years old. I've never taken a 1-month vacation. Yeah. But I sure as hell had businesses where I could have taken a 2-month, 3-month, 4-month vacation, and the business would have run itself. Yeah. Because I built a solid team around me, because I had SOPs, because I mitigated the risk of single points of failure. Yeah, it makes sense. I was when Peter Lohman was launching Crane, or he had launched Crane, and I'm like the community guy, right? Like I care about community. So we got on a call, and I'm like, man, you gotta make something North Star of like what's cool in your community. And I was just kind of like telling him that I was giving him that spiel of how you award status inside of a community in order to make it grow, and it's got to also be visible outside of the community. He's like, dude, my thing has been the 1-month vacation, right? Like we're doing this thing of like 1 week, 2 week vacation, 1-month vacation as like rings on the Crane pin. And I thought that it was like the best idea ever. And now I'm realizing that that's an even more valuable piece of just like, it's just not just a philosophical thing, but also an enterprise value and a strategic business thing. And I think that's really cool. So it builds value, definitely builds value for your business. Yeah.
Awesome. Is it fair to say that people that are thinking about buying property management businesses aren't necessarily just thinking about buying property management business? They're looking for some kind of buy box in an EBITDA of a certain level and these characteristics that you're saying, and they may or may not be looking at property management business over here, and maybe, I don't know, dry cleaning business or something else like that. How common is that? Are people that am I more likely to have someone coming to me if I'm a property manager that is looking at a bunch of property management businesses, or am I more likely to be talking to someone that's like a little more agnostic to what the business itself is and more about the attributes of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're going to get both, right? There's searchers. We call people that are looking for these type of businesses searchers. And they're searchers that have a very narrow buy box. They're looking at a specific industry or 2 or 3, in a very tight geography. And then there's people that are looking for types of businesses that have certain characteristics, not necessarily industries, right? They're industry agnostic, but if you look at my buy box, right? Yeah. So I love property management. That's kind of like at the top for me, but I also will buy other businesses where, the things that I look for, the boxes that I need checked are that I need a solid management team. I need a team. A business that's too small, doesn't have a team, is not a business that I'm interested in. I want to know that there's a business that has a team that can run the business in my absence and in the absence of the seller. I want a business that's low capex. I want a business that either has or has the potential for some sort of recurring revenue, right? And then I have, industries that I stay away from, restaurant, retail, right? And so, buy boxes look different for everybody. It depends on where they are in their careers. It depends on their skill sets. It depends on what their goals are, So to answer your question, you're going to get both. You're going to get both.
I got two questions from that. One is, what are the other ones? Like, what are other verticals that you have really kicked it around and compared it to by a property management business or not?
When you say compare it to, what do you mean? Compare it to a property management business? I don't really compare.
I mean, in your buy box, give
at?
me other samples of the types of businesses that fit into that buy box.
Home services,
Home services.
pest control,
Okay.
trade services to some extent, as long as they're not project, too heavily concentrated on project based or new construction.
Yeah.
HVAC, electric, lawn maintenance, MSPs, managed service providers on the tech side are great. Those are all recurring revenue type businesses, right? Or have the potential for them.
Recurring revenue, service-based businesses that have a heavy people element.
They're hopefully low capex, even though some of the ones I mentioned, they're going to have a little bit higher capex. If you look at manufacturing, super high capex.
Okay.
Right, which is why I didn't mention it.
Asking for a friend. Does labor count as capex? What is and what isn't capex?
No, capex is depreciable assets.
Depreciable assets.
So, there's, sellers like to price their businesses on earnings, on EBITDA, which is before depreciation. But depreciation, in the words of Charlie Munger, is a real expense.
Yeah.
He said, what did he say? He said, EBITDA is bullshit. And the code word for EBITDA is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
And because, it's real. I mean, whether you write the check now or whether you write the check in 5 years, you need to be accruing for it because you're going to write that check.
Yeah.
Right?
Got it. And then you said property managers right at the top of these things that you really, really like. What makes property management versus these other ones something that is like at the top of this thing that you really, really
For
like?
me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for one, I know the business, right? So as a startup guy, I've started and exited, 6 different businesses in a variety of different, verticals, none of which were property management. But, as I built my wealth, I invested in real estate. And I bought my first piece of real estate at 19 years old. And, so I started building my portfolio and, I self-managed for a while. And then I got to the point that I couldn't self-manage. And so I started hiring property managers. And then I started bringing some of it back in and building my own property management team in-house. So for me, it was a business that it was very easy for me to understand. I get the business. I understand the business. I understand the value. I see the value as a property owner and I see the value as a property manager. And so, it was low-hanging fruit for me. I just got it. And then, oh, by the way, it's very predictable recurring revenue. It's a sticky customer. As long as you as a property manager are doing a good job, it's a very sticky customer. It's not, clients don't switch property managers unless they have to, right? Or the property sells, right? Which nobody can really control to some extent. So for me, property management, low capex, right? Service business, high margin. It's a people business. And so that's why property management for me is at the top of the list.
Got it.
If I maybe had a background in trade services, then maybe a trade service business would be on the top of the list for me.
Makes sense. I'm trying to reverse engineer, if I'm listening to this conversation, what I want to take out of it, right? In order to tee that up for our friend that's listening. And what I'm hearing is essentially the value in the conversation. Someone comes knocking is kind of qualify someone as, hey, are you someone that's invested in real estate before, right? Like people that have...
You're talking about qualifying a buyer?
Qualifying the buyer, but more than, I'm not talking about I'm using the word qualifying without meaning it in a technical way. I'm just thinking as a sales guy or a business developer of how I can speak in terms of the things that interest them and how I can find people that are truly going to want my baby as opposed to someone that wants to put my baby to work for them. And I'm thinking of the emotional triggers of, is this someone that has, touched and felt and self-managed some of their own real estate in the past? I'm thinking of someone that
Why is that important?
It feels like I heard that you feel comfortable in the idea that you've been a part of it before.
Yes.
Right. And I may have just told myself this, but the other thing I hear is I think real estate investors really do value this idea of providing housing for people. And there's an even more,
There's a few. Yeah, there's a kumbaya moment there.
there's
in there
something
somewhere.
to that, right?
Yeah.
There's something to that. And I would assume that someone that has felt that and has felt the pain of self-managing and the value of like the management, and B, understands that kind of like, for me, investing in real estate, it's like one part providing people housing is important to me. Another part, fair housing and not being a jerk is important to me. Another part is this like idealistic thing that I have around real estate really being the spine of the American dream. Like it is the upward mobility lever, and being a part of that feels cool.
Those are all reasons for someone to be in property management.
Yeah.
Right. I think your question was, as a seller of a property management company,
Yeah.
How do you analyze a buyer and
Yeah.
you pick a buyer that's, I mean, it depends what you want
Yeah.
as a seller. The property management company that I just bought, Kleinman, out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, it's a 95-year-old business, legacy business. That seller was interested in preserving that legacy. That seller wanted to make sure that his clients were taken care of. That seller wanted to make sure that his employees were taken care of. That seller wanted a buyer that wasn't going to come in and change things up drastically, right? And so for that seller, a buyer like me was perfect, right? A guy that maybe understood HVAC, maybe was good too, because that guy's not going to come in and try to roll up the business or do something else. But if you're a seller that all you want is a check, and the biggest check you can probably get, then your buyer has a different profile. Then you don't care about any of those things, right? Now, to be fair, most sellers do care what happens to their business, and do care what happens to their clients, and do care what happens to their employees. And so if they want to preserve the legacy of their business, they are going to put it in someone that they feel is going to create the best environment for their existing business. It could be, now their business could be lacking a really good operator. And so for that seller, he's going to want somebody with a lot of experience that's willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work, right? For me, in this particular deal, the business was humming. They had a solid number 275 employees. Employees that had been there 50 years.
Yeah.
The average tenure was 13 years, average.
Yeah.
With many in their 20s and 30 years there. And so, he wanted to make sure that, that didn't get disrupted and that culture didn't get disrupted. So a seller that was semi-passive, or buyer, I'm sorry, that was semi-passive like me was ideal. I was going to come in, I was going to write a check, and I was going to just provide, strategic oversight, some growth management, and just, preserve the legacy of that company and its employees and the clients and all that.
Thank you for clarifying that, right? Because I'm like the rookie coming in, and I can imagine somebody who's just like built their property management business, not thinking about this in the back end, going through this type of stuff of like, oh, okay, so it's not just about like, how can I woo a seller? It should really be about what I want. What I want for the future of my business to be and what really matters to me. And that's how I qualify someone. So that's really good. So I guess apart from the fact that you walked in there wanting to be passive and keeping the team in place and not wanting to ruffle any feathers, what other ways do you, let's put myself in the shoes of, because I am this person, right? Like I really care what happens to my team if I'm, as I got acquired by Vendoroo and whatnot, right? Like, put myself in the shoes of a property manager that's like, okay, no, I really do want to, I do really want to qualify someone for, they're not going to like run this thing to the ground or like crush it. What does a buyer do to kind of like prove those things?
Well, I mean, obviously you got to vet the buyer. What does a seller do?
Yeah, what does a seller
do?
Yeah.
You got to qualify the buyer.
Yeah.
You want to vet the buyer. You want to...
What's that look like?
Well, I think it depends on a few things. I think, so somebody that doesn't want to upset the current status quo of the business, I think you want to see what their plans are. What is your plan? Is your plan to grow this nationally? Is your plan to, just run it the way we've been running it? Is your plan to bring in your own team of young MBAs and, inject all sorts of new things and ruffle feathers and make everybody uncomfortable?
So that's a fair conversation. Show me your business plan for the future of this thing.
Yeah. So what do you want? But you have to do it in a way that's, in a casual way early on. What are your thoughts for this business? What are your plans for this business? How do you see this business going from here under your leadership? Right? How do my people fit or not fit under your leadership?
Yeah.
If you've got concerns and you want to make sure your people are taken care of, employment agreements are a great way to do that. And usually it's the buyer. In this particular case, me as a buyer, I came in and I offered those on my own free will. But as a seller, they could say, look, I'll sell you my business, but I want to make sure that these employees get employment agreements, right? I want to make sure that, these clients, we extend their contracts if you have concerns about clients losing contracts. It's you de-risk a deal. De-risking, usually you hear that term as a buyer coming in, how do I de-risk this deal? But as a seller, you can de-risk the deal too, right? I mean, you know what you want at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. And so, put the parameters and draft and paper around the issues that concern you.
Yeah.
In this last deal, one of the issues that concerned me was that some of the clients would leave, right? Because this company, our new owner coming in, the other guy had been there so long, they had relationships with them. So, we created a, partial seller note that was forgivable. If clients left, if a certain number of clients left, part of the note, the seller note, got forgiven. And so that's how I de-risked that particular risk, right? And so there's ways to do it on the other side too.
Interesting. What's a way to do it on the other side?
Well, like I said, you can, if I'm
Employment
concerned
contracts.
that you're going to fire my top 5 employees, then I want you to give them 2-year employment contracts.
Is there a world where that same buyer, the same seller would have been like, you know what? Why don't we just take a tour and talk to my clients, and you can talk to them and they'll know that you're good? Like, is that, I'm just trying to figure out, as someone that hasn't done this a lot, has kind of just gone through this too.
That's not good enough. That's not strong enough.
That's not strong
because maybe the client could say whatever, they could say something today and feel differently tomorrow.
Yeah.
They're going to get approached as soon as they may get approached by competitors.
Yeah.
And try to get poached that way.
Yeah.
And so, no, I think you have to protect yourself in a more solid way. You're asking, this question of, the seller de-risking the deal from their end.
Yeah.
I've never been asked that before, and it's an interesting perspective because it's rare, right? It's usually the buyer coming in
because you're more sophisticated as the buyer, right?
Well, I don't know. I just think in general it's rare. It's the seller's just looking to get out, right? And so I think the majority, the extent of de-risking that a seller does is just picking the right buyer, right? They don't generally put mechanisms. Like, I've never seen a seller say to me, I want you to give these guys an employment agreement. I probably wouldn't do it, because how can I give somebody an employment agreement until I've gotten to know them? And typically a seller is going to be very quiet and very restrictive on you contacting their employers until the deal's done. And so it's interesting. It's interesting that you're looking at it that way, because I think it's a fair way to look at it. I think as a seller, and look, in today's world, there's more buyers than sellers. There are a lot of buyers out there right now.
Got it.
And so it is definitely a seller's market. And so a seller could very well, ask for things that aren't maybe typical.
Yeah. I mean,
Try doing that with private equity. I don't think that'll go.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Pretty cool that Nick was telling me that he didn't usually answer these questions about de-risking the deal from the seller side. And, what I realize is that most owners that think like me are really not just trying to de-risk a deal when selling it, but they're trying to create quality of life for their employees, for their teammates, and people that work with them. And I think that's where AI really comes into play. It's this idea of getting people out of the mundane and getting them into what I like to call the right seat of the right bus, right? Getting them to do the things that they love to do. And that's what we want to help you do here at Vendoroo. We want to automate the mundane through AI, handle these 80 to 85% of work orders that really just don't move the needle for you, and put your people into the roles where only they can do, that they will love to do. This idea of building relationships, adding value, proactively reaching out and being more of a wow factor company. That's the promise of agentic AI. That's what Vendoroo can do for you on the maintenance side. So if you want to do that, if you want to get your team out of the mundane and into the critical, into the things that really matter, and more motivated than ever, go to vendoroo.ai and book a demo with us. Hope to talk to you soon. Enjoy the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, full transparency, right? I'm just going through the process of selling my business to Vendoroo, right? And I'm just very concerned about the future of my employees. I'm staying on board, right? Like I'm selling because I want in on this journey.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different from me. So
It's a conversation that's
really
fair to
thought about
have, and it's a
de-risking.
conversation you should have. And you know, employment agreements are a great way to do it. Sometimes just sitting down with the buyer and getting a gut feel may get you comfortable enough.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you don't need the employment agreement.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And that was certainly true for me. I definitely didn't want to rush into it without doing some work with them for about 3 months, understanding the culture, getting a feel for the fact that, especially since I was staying on, getting a feel for the fact that our founder just really gets me, like the questions he was asking about how I do stuff. I found that really, really a sign. Like the questions being asked by Reza gave me an insight into like how much he's actually valuing the things that we know how to do and how much he's thought about it. I thought was really good.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And that's what I mean about sometimes just getting comfortable. Just, you know, that's sometimes enough.
Yeah. All right.
I took on a lot of risks that weren't de-risked or paper, you know, that I didn't contract around. And it's in this last deal, and it's because I was dealing with a super high integrity seller. And the whole employees, the whole employee team, very high integrity.
Yeah.
Great culture. Right. And so it just felt right.
Yeah.
You know, certainly I had to de-risk certain things, and my lender required me to de-risk certain things. But I felt good about that deal. And look, so far I was right. You know, everything's been going. It's been 4 months, I think, now, and everything's been great.
I can tell you love it, man. I love talking to you about the business. It's really, really cool. Yeah. All right. So let's talk. I want to talk about technology, but I would like to start with it from the standpoint of, you said, you know, it's the key man risk is a really big part of it, right? And when I think of the application of technology towards key man risk, I very naturally in this AI space think this is a major lever for de-risking key man stuff if I can really get agentic AI to take over some stuff. But then if I also look at it on the other side, I think if I invest too much in technology, maybe you're not seeing enough meat on the bone to ramp up the business and get extra profit and all these other things. So like, let's start with the idea of, does a sophisticated buyer like you come into a business looking for a bit of a technological gap that you can kind of like, you know, get some meat off of when you come in?
Well, you know, it's a good question. And in this ETA space, it's one of the levers that get used a lot to increase value, right? Yeah. I mean, typically you're dealing with rumor type businesses, right? That, you know, aren't very tech savvy. I mean, fax machines still in the office, right? And so one of the levers that you pull to make the business more profitable, more efficient, and more scalable is bringing in technology. So it's very, very common. I do think you need to be careful about how you do it. And, you know, you need to do it in a way that everybody, that your team is very comfortable with, you know, or you risk losing it, right? I mean, if you come in too hard with that too quick, I think that there's risks associated with that, and so you need to be cognizant of that. But I do think it's a lever that is pulled quite often, and it's a lever that needs to get pulled. Look, even if you're not selling your business, you need to be evolving your business. And so to not pull those levers, even if you're not selling your business, is wrong, right? You have to be evolving, right? I mean, tell Kodak that, right?
Yes.
So either, you know, evolve or die. And so technology is part of a business's evolution.
I'm glad you brought up Kodak. I'm literally in the works of working on this keynote that I have for a conference coming up about the innovator's dilemma in property management, right? And it's like Kodak is like the classic example of the innovator's dilemma.
So that sucks. Imagine if you're Kodak, man, you just keep getting dragged into the mud.
Yeah,
that's just like
Kodak, Blockbuster. To me, Kodak, Blockbuster, and Sears are kind of like the ultimate, just kicking the nuts, epic businesses.
Didn't get it, missed it. They were so good at what they did. Oh yeah, got a little arrogant, got a little cocky, and took their eye off the ball for a minute.
Yeah, you know? But it makes so much sense to me, man, right? Like as I think of this innovator's dilemma, and it's part of the core thing of my thesis of what we're talking about coming over here, the story, something really interesting that I learned about Blockbuster Number one, I knew that Blockbuster had the chance to buy Netflix for peanuts.
Was it $10 million?
And they laughed at it.
It was $10 million.
They laughed him out the
They
door.
threw him out
So,
of the room.
we can do this with DVDs by mail. But what they didn't realize was, solving for this subscription service DVDs by mail would lower their profit per square foot of their retail space. And once that stat started lowering, they completely scrapped the idea of this is the evolution of where the space is going, and they got sucked back into their old metric. Right? So that was like a big one that really hit for me of it doesn't just happen because of inertia. It doesn't just happen because, oh, well, this is going well enough, I want to do this. It happens because we're aligned around these like specific goals and metrics that once you've been like talking that language for so long, it's very difficult to launch something else with a completely different philosophy that's going to have a very different looking P&L and scorecard.
Yeah. Well, the DVD by mail was, and the streaming was obviously going to cannibalize their brick and mortar sales. And, I've got history in the brick and mortar space, and, I always used to say, either you cannibalize yourself or somebody else is going to do it.
Yeah.
And I just think that in Blockbuster's case, one of the things that they were thinking about is when you've got that number of stores and that much real estate and leases and long-term leases, 10 and 15-year leases, it's hard to get away from that. It's expensive to get away from that. Yeah. And so they basically defended it, longer than they should have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. So then let's bring it back to property management. As you're taking, I'm not going to say you're taking over, but you just purchased a very like ingrained, almost 100 years old. I heard you on Danny's podcast. Like I'm already working on that 100-year party. I want to MC it. Or at least do something, right? Like, can I host a karaoke party?
100%, done deal.
Yeah, awesome. But how are you thinking about this idea of the future of the space, technological adoption? You just said that you have to, when you're the guy taking it over, you got to be real careful of like what you tell them how to do.
Yeah.
But you are a guy that's steering the ship towards technological adoption. How do you think about that?
Yeah. So let me be clear. We don't have fax machines at Kleinman. So despite the fact that we're 95 years old, we're not dinosaurs. So we do embrace technology. We lean into it pretty well. But we need to continue to do that. There's a lot of innovations happening in the space. Yeah. And so, look, these guys are in the business every day. They know what their needs are. They're smart. They're intelligent. They're well-read. They're informed. And so my job as the owner is to just make sure that they're thinking about it and thinking about, I want this to be their idea, not my idea. Yeah. Right?
That makes sense.
And so, if it's their idea, I feel better about the idea because if they're seeing it and they're endorsing it, and they're in the business day in, day out, and they've been doing this longer than I have, then it's something I need to listen to. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. What do we need? There's also, I think, the risk of going a little bit too overboard, even from an operational standpoint. I mean, tons of SaaS tools out there. If you over SaaS this thing, clients aren't going to. I'm going to coin that term. If you over SaaS this thing, you're going to piss off customers. You're going to disrupt the processes. You're going to disrupt employees. And so it's responsible use of technology is kind of the way we refer to it at Kleinman. Yeah. And look, we're looking at things, especially on the maintenance side, on the tenant side and on the client side. I think we're pretty solid with our tech stack. We're happy with our tech stack. Our clients are happy with our tech stack, but we got to keep our eyes open. We got to make sure we don't become that Kodak.
Yeah, I love oversassing.
It's a great term.
It's good. Yeah. It's good. And you know what it makes me think is, and this is thanks to doing this podcast and thanks to getting to travel around.
Oh, this is fun.
Yeah, this is fun. What it makes me think of is I've recently realized, I had an aha moment in talking to Reza of the fundamental kind of like business model of SaaS emerged because there was so much like meat on the bone and efficiency that could emerge from these like better tools, right? And as it's matured, and particularly in this space, I hear it a lot, right? There's just a lot of like broken promises on how much this tool can actually do for you when it's just like, as it continues to help you be better and better, there's just like less and less marginal kind of like better that you can do and a high cost of switching. The fundamental difference between the SaaS movement and this new agentic AI movement is the idea that SaaS tools were always meant to build a better tool but strategically they were built to like not own the outcome, right? Like strategically they were built to just like, how can we just kind of like be part of this but not be responsible for this?
Just a function, provide a function.
Yeah, and
Not the
the
result.
responsibility is on the person using it, really, right? While like this like agentic AI movement is really much more around, how can we just like own this? How can this go away for you?
That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. It's kind of like that. Computers don't make mistakes; people make mistakes.
Yeah.
Kind of the same.
Yeah. So now it's like, how do we make it so the computer's doing it so that there's no people to make
So they
mistakes?
save it, so they own it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they own the whole thing.
Yeah. And that's why when I think of this idea of the key man risk, you know, maybe there's a shift of going from seeing this, you know, seeing technological adoption as this like lever to pull in efficiency, where it might turn into this lever to pull in reducing key man risk.
But isn't the key man risk really just transferred from the key man to the provider?
True.
Right? It gives the provider a ton of leverage.
It does give the provider a ton of leverage. Yeah. You're saying the AI builder.
Yeah, whoever you're buying that service from, unless you're doing it internally yourself.
Yeah, so talk me through that. Talk me through how you think about that then.
Well, I'm just thinking about it now for the first time. I mean, it just popped in my head, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess years of experience make me look at things, you know, a little differently.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I could see my AI vendor squeezing me for profits when they know that I'm so dependent on them, right? Unless it's a competitive landscape, right? And you know, and unless it's easy to switch and it's a competitive environment, right? So if it's a true competitive environment, then I guess that's not as big an issue, right? Because the market will, you know, dictate where they need to be. But if you're reliant on just, you know, one provider, then yeah, man. I mean, that's another single point of failure right there.
Makes
and
sense.
what happens if something happens to them? What happens if they mismanage? What happens if they go bankrupt?
Yep.
It's not just pricing. You know, it's another single point of failure. So depends what the competitive landscape is. You don't want to be the only one providing the service, right?
I like it, man. I like it because I think of what my buy box needs to be as if I'm a buyer of the AI movement, and I think I had already thought of, there has to be a low cost of switching, right? Like I'm a big believer that right now the generation of softwares, there's like the softwares that were built in the 2000s that feel like Salesforce-y. I think you guys are operating on something that feels kind of that way, right? Like the UX is just kind of like, you know, it's not there, but you can really customize it if you have a team that really makes the most.
And you
of
know
it,
it's solid.
then it's awesome.
It may not be
and
pretty.
It's rock
it may not be
solid,
pretty,
bro,
but
right?
it's solid.
It's a CJ7. Right? Like, CJ7s are beautiful, just saying.
Jeeps,
but,
I had
yeah,
them.
yeah. But that being said, then there's like the ones that came out in the 210s, right? That are really like made for the property manager, have a better UX, and are a little bit more user friendly. And now but we're done before like the assumption that AI needs to be infused into everything. And now there's a new generation of this like AI native thought out solutions that are coming out.
What I like, I mean, I think where I would get comfortable with it is if my CRM had multiple AI providers that I could just plug into API, right? I could just flip a switch and okay, now I'm moving here, now I'm moving there. That would get me more comfortable.
You're going exactly where I was going with it, right? To me, and to me, it's Rentvine, right? Like to me, that's the big thing that Rentvine has done in the space. And I don't know how familiar you are with all of these, like, what they call property management softwares, but Rentvine is really the one that's like come out in the last like 7 years. I think they just raised like $70 million, and their entire POV is open, right? Like we are open so that you don't have to completely change your like full infrastructure. You can plug things in and out. And I've evolved my thesis enough to be like, I know that you need to build on an open architecture so that you can plug in and plug out agents and not just be held hostage by another company telling you, no, you just got to wait till I build it for you kind of thing. That feels very, very real to me. And then I guess the other thing that I'm hearing from you, which makes a lot of sense, is that the AI provider needs to give you some kind of like, if the company goes under, that AI agent still needs to be yours in some way. Like there has to be some kind of thing that's still your guy.
There needs to be a plan.
Yeah, there needs to be a plan.
There needs to be a disaster plan, a recovery plan.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I could see it. I'm not the tech guy, obviously, but I could see it as kind of like, you know, if this intelligence gets so evolved by you over the next 4 years that it's turned into your Terminator, that it can remain your Terminator no matter what happens to the provider, right? Like the provider was just somebody that was doing something on the back end that can get switched out.
Yeah, and remember, you're not just disrupting me as a property manager. You'd be disrupting our clients,
everybody,
our tenants.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a fiduciary duty to these people.
Well, I get it.
You know.
I get it. Yeah. When I went through a partnership breakup, in my past. And the number one thing that I thought about was like, how do I insulate my clients from, and like my team and my clients from the disruption, right? So you got to think of it that much if you're going all in on something like that.
Yeah.
Same as if you're selling it, right? Like how am I not disrupting everything else, right?
Yeah.
Interesting, man. So I would love to jam on kind of a little bit of what we were talking about on the way back here of just the future of the space and what you think it's going to do. You were telling me that the number one thing is essentially like a liability shell, or not a liability shell, compliance.
Compliance, yeah. People think of, the value that property management companies like Kleinman provide, and they immediately think, oh, they help with rent collection. Oh, and they help with maintenance. Maintenance is such a headache, and they make that headache go away, and evictions and all the ugly stuff, and valid points. But I think really what we're seeing with Kleinman is compliance is a huge liability for property owners, for our clients. And we mitigate that liability, right? Especially when you're in states that are very tenant friendly, like Minnesota, right? The Minnesota Housing Authority, just came out with new regs. And, my understanding is that they're updating those pretty frequently. And so, as a client, typically these guys are, these are passive investments for them, or they want them to be passive investments for them. And so they can handle some of the stuff in-house, but, compliance becomes a real problem. It's a real liability, right? Every tenant is a liability potentially. And so, we look at the fact that, we understand the rules. We make it our job to understand the changes in compliance and compliance space. And we train our employees so they understand it.
Yeah.
And then we monitor them to make sure that they're adhering to them. So, it's like a 3-step process, right? It's learning the compliance, training on compliance, and then monitoring to make sure there's adherence. And so, I think that's at the top of the list. It's a big, it's a big thing that we focus on, and it's a huge pain point for our clients that we make go away for the most part.
So my question to that is, I can accept that today compliance is the main problem to solve. I really do wonder, when we look at functions and things that the business operates, the idea of compliance and keeping up with compliance feels like such an easy problem to solve. Like it feels like an easier problem to solve with technology of like keeping somebody up to date with compliance and stuff getting automated into it. That if that's the whole value prop, it just doesn't feel like it has a lot of moat to it. What am I missing there?
Well, I think that that's an interesting point. I think the step one, right? I said 3 steps. Step one of learning and keeping up with the compliance. I think AI could do a phenomenal job of that, right? As long as it's got the right data and access to the data.
Yeah.
I think training the employees could probably be automated. The adherence part, step 3, is probably going to be
The hardest.
To try to throw AI at. You could use AI for some stuff and make sure you're not sending out certain letters and certain forms and certain language and letters that you're not supposed to say, or that you're remembering to send letters with a certain time frame and you're not breaking rules. But I think that'll be the tougher of the 3. But I think that AI could do a great job at helping with compliance. For sure. Yeah. I can see that.
I think fundamentally, there's no question that there's always going to be humans in property management. Somebody's still going to have to walk in that door to fix that sink.
Yeah.
Particularly in the maintenance, I guess.
Yep. On the maintenance side, that's never going to go away.
Yeah.
On the leasing side, you could reduce human contact, but there's still going to be some. I think there's going to be very few people that are going to be willing to commit and sign a lease based on a virtual tour. Some will. But some people are going to want to see it. They're going to want to walk the neighborhood, walk the community. Remember, we deal with primarily multifamily.
Yeah.
And so, but I think you can reduce a lot of it. You know, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It'll be interesting to see how it's received, both on the client side to some extent,
Yeah.
and on the tenant and resident side.
What do you think about that theory that I was telling you of like the Amazon effect of either by metro area or like a national player? I guess you're more well versed in the multifamily space. Do you feel comfortable opining on the single family space?
I mean, a high level
Yeah.
in terms of just general business knowledge. You know,
Yeah.
I can give you my opinions
For
and
sure.
so forth. But
Which is what we're doing here, right?
yeah, yeah.
So this idea, like I could see South Florida market, right? We're in South Florida right now. I could see there being a category king in the property management space for the single family asset that kind of like, is managing, figures out this extremely leveraged, high quality way, highly technologically enabled function of maintaining properties, of doing the property management for the single family home investors here, and really dominates the market with maybe two or three other people that are relevant making money, and the rest of them kind of just like old school property managers that are just kind of like struggling to survive, and then a whole bunch of one person, I don't know what the number of homes has to be, but like if one person by themselves could really manage 100 to 200 or maybe even a 300 door portfolio based on a whole bunch of AI, virtual goggles have taken place. So like now you can do the walkthroughs without ever going, and that's really mass adopted. All you need is access to a contractor base that is now, Uberfied in some kind of way. And you have these like akin to either like a one person, $1 million e-commerce business, or like the one person Airbnb business that is now a hotelier because they have 50 units that they can do. How do you think that's even possible? Like when I say that, are you just like, oh, yeah, whatever, Pablo, you read too many tech books, or
I mean, look, I don't know if that's where it's going. I don't think that's where we are today, right?
obviously not?
Right. I think that creates. I don't think it lasts. It stays that way for a long time. I think it becomes a highly fragmented market, and you know what happens to highly fragmented markets? They get rolled up.
Yeah.
So, that is one of the likely outcomes. I mean, I think we've seen some of that on the multifamily space already. There's been roll-ups there, and so, I don't think it stays highly fragmented on the single-family side for a very long time. Not at large scale, anyway.
Yeah.
That would be my opinion. What the hell do I know?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me. But then I also think of like, is that happening in the Airbnb space? Like, is there a roll up space happening right now of like Airbnb, small time Airbnb operators selling into like larger conglomerate of Airbnb operators?
That is happening a little bit.
Yeah.
That is
And
happening
that's
a
like
little
10
bit.
years in, 12 years into
I
it.
don't know who the players are there. I don't really follow it. I find it interesting.
Okay.
There's a lot of tech around that space too.
Yeah.
That's evolving.
Yeah.
But that's, and talking about compliance there and regulations and so forth to have to manage,
That's another one.
Yeah,
that to me is the one that I find most like a like comparison. It's like guys like me could have never been a hotelier 20 years ago, like in that business.
Yeah.
And now there's plenty of guys like me that are really operating a hospitality
and
business.
you could do it by owning the assets. You could do it by just managing the assets.
Yeah.
There's
and it all came because of like a marketplace with ratings and a certain level of like technological scale. So that's kind of like the most thing that I could see when I try to put my lenses on and think of like what are the possibilities of how single family home property management could evolve. That seems like a very highly likely kind of like parallel path of it that could lead to ground up disruption as opposed to top down disruption.
Yeah, I'm still surprised by the size of the single family property management space. I just, I never, until I started digging into it, never anticipated that it was as large as it was.
It's massive.
That there were that many single family homes
Yeah.
out there on the rental market and being managed the way they are. So it's, it's interesting. I'll be watching.
Yeah, me too, man.
I'll be watching, looking for opportunities.
Anything else, man? Anything else interesting that comes to mind?
No, man, it's good to chat with you. It's crazy how, none of us, when we did our first podcast, none of us were in the property management space.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
other than me, managing my own properties. And here we are, full circle. What's it been, 10 years?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Right around like 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here we are both in property management. Kind of weird.
Yeah.
I'm
It's
back at a
interesting.
podcast, so.
And now, and you were like episode 2 of my podcast, and now you're however many other, like whatever. What I find really interesting, man, is just how we became friends because somebody somebody that I've known my whole life invited me into a fantasy football like league. Eddie and Danny invited me to this fantasy football league.
I hated that you got in there. Because
I
that league was so easy to win until you got there.
know that's why I'm not
And
there
here
anymore.
comes this guy with running stats and like knows what he's talking about. I'm like, shit. Now I got to really pay attention.
Yeah.
I don't think I won another
appreciate
championship since.
I appreciate the flattery. My favorite part of it is the idea that you guys didn't really believe I was a real person because all I was doing was writing, like making fun of each other, using all the old jokes from past fantasy football emails to you. And the idea that like it really is, I honestly think that that's now that I've done 1,000 podcasts and I've made many, many great relationships through content creation, I really think that yours and my relationship was my first ever relationship that actually happened based on content creation leading to a friendship, man.
Fantasy football content.
Yeah, fantasy football content. So that all being said, man, I appreciate you doing this, man.
Awesome, man.
I appreciate you being a friend to me
course.
all these years, and thanks a lot.
Of course.
Yeah,
Likewise.
cool.